I'm so happy to be here, and I hope you're all doing well in this very crazy period. I am excited to be able to share with you a little bit about one of my passions, that of course is product. The other passion is teaching, and this is one of the reasons why I keep coming back to MSME to share some of what I've learned in my years of experience. So as Linda mentioned, we're going to be talking about turning ideas into product and the role of product manager. So with that, I wanted to start with just a little bit of why is product management important? And this graph is from CB Insight. That's an analyst that tracks a lot of startups. And what they do on a regular basis is they do this sort of postmortems on startups that fail, and they find the top 20 reasons why startups fail. And they've been doing this for a while and keep adding more data. But the reality is that the shape of this graph is not changing much. And if you look, 7 out of the top 10 reasons why startups fail are related to a failure in product, and I would claim to a failure in product management. And the top reason is that there was no market need for the product that the startup developed. But there's also things like it was a poor product, they ignored the customers, the competition was doing a better job. So as you can see, the success or failure of a startup is very, very directly related to the success or failure of the product. And what does that mean from the perspective of the responsibility of a product manager, or in larger organizations, the responsibility of the product management team? As a product manager, you are responsible for defining the right product at the right time. And what that means is really defining the functionality and the product that's going to serve a need that exists in the market, and that it's a product that can be delivered with the technology that exists in the time frame that's needed by the market. You are responsible for getting the product built. Now, product managers don't build the product themselves, and product managers don't control the engineering organization. Engineering does not report into the product management organization. So as a product manager, you have the responsibility to essentially tell engineering what they need to build, but you need to get them aligned because they don't report into you. And finally, as a product manager, you're actually responsible for delivering the product to the market. You don't do it by yourself, but you need to work closely with marketing, with sales, with customer success to deliver that product to the market. It's a lot more than just making sure that a software is completed. So because of this big responsibility, there is a very common idea that the product manager is the CEO of the product. There's some truth to that because the product manager is very much responsible for the success or failure of the product. But I don't think that this is the right comparison. It's more like you're the orchestra conductor, because you don't really have control over the people who are building the product, but you're guiding them. And the other piece that's very true is that you're also the janitor. When something falls through the cracks, it is the product manager's responsibility to figure out, to either do it or find somebody else to do it. But the product manager needs to be watching for everything that's associated with ensuring that the product will be successful. So with that in mind, this is a diagram that you probably will have seen, and I actually like it because it really is, as a product manager, you're living in the intersection between design and user experience, the technology and the business. From the business perspective, you need to make sure that the product that you want to build is viable. From the design perspective, you want to make sure that's product that's desired by the consumers or the customers. And from the technology side, you need to make sure that the product that you want to build can be built with the technology that's available. So before we get into kind of the stages of the product life cycle, I wanted to touch on a little bit on the lean product concepts. And I'm sure, and if I had a show of hands, which I can't see, but if I had a show of hands and I asked you, you had heard about the lean startup concepts, you probably would have, because that's been very big in Silicon Valley. But the concept, the lean methodology essentially is based on the idea that you want to be testing your hypotheses for your business model as fast as you can and fail fast before investing a lot of money. And the concept is that those hypotheses can be tested and evaluated before you really go off and build a full business. So those concepts also apply to product. And there are three key concepts that are important from the product perspective. The first one is the concept of product market fit. And Dan Olson, who wrote a book called the Lean Product Management book, has a nice way to present it. In the bottom of this pyramid, what you see is the market. And in the top of the pyramid is your product. And in between is your product market fit. And the idea is that each layer in this pyramid is a hypothesis that needs to be tested. On one hand, you have a theory about the right target customers and the underserved needs, the problems that you want to solve for them. So these are hypotheses that you have. And then on the product side, you have a value proposition and then a set of features that you want to deliver for them. And you want to be testing each of those hypotheses as you progress, so that in case one of those hypotheses turns out to not be true, you have the chance to adjust. So the second component of these key concepts, which is related to this, is this concept of iteration and validated learning. You want to be validating your hypotheses about the market, about the needs that that target market have, and about how well your product ideas map. And you want to validate those ideas and learn. And if necessary, rework and pivot. If, as you're validating the idea you had about the needs in the market, you realize that those needs actually don't exist or are not important, you better pivot and find something else before you invest a lot of engineering resources in building a product that your target customers are not going to care about. So with those concepts in mind, one thing that's very important is that they don't apply equally to all types of products. If you read a lot of the literature lately on product and startups, there's a lot of this concept of iterating fast and failing fast, and put something out there, see if people like it, and iterate. That works very well for certain products. If you have a business to consumer product that's free, that you just want to test things, that's fine. You can do a lot of that testing. But if you have an enterprise product that you're trying to sell to big companies, those companies are not going to be happy with you throwing something and see if it works, because they have to put an investment on their side to actually implement your product and test it. So some of this level of iteration and failing fast works very well in certain products, but not in others. And of course, if you're doing product for the health industry, for example, that has to do with medical issues, well, you definitely cannot have the concept of failing fast. So this is just for you to keep in mind, because you will read a lot of the literature on this go fast, try all things and fail fast. It doesn't work for every type of product or industry. So with that, let me just stop here for a second, Linda. And is there any kind of burning question that you've gotten in the chat?
There's no questions yet.
Okay, good. So let's start with the product life cycle. And what I want to kind of give you a view is, how do products evolve and what's the role of the product manager in each step of the life cycle? So typically products start with an identified problem that somebody wants to solve. This is an idea. And then what you want to do is evaluate that opportunity. Is that problem worth solving, building a whole product to solve that problem? Or is it not worth investing in it? Once you decide that, yes, there is an opportunity, that there is a problem to be solved here that the customers will want, then you start designing the solution. So you move from identifying the problem, evaluating that's worth fixing or addressing, to designing the solution. And only then you go to building the product, or essentially having engineering build the product. And then you actually have to deliver the product to the market. And we'll talk more about what I mean with delivering the whole product to the market. And then you measure, and you need to measure the success of the product. And unless your product is such a failure that it only has a version 1, most products will have a version 1 and 2 and will continue to evolve and iterate. So you essentially go back not to identify necessarily a new problem, but to add functionality, add capabilities to the existing product. And for each of those new pieces of functionality, you do want to evaluate whether it's something that's going to be valuable enough for your consumers, for your users, or not. Eventually, some products will be retired, and you will typically retire a product when it's becoming obsolete, when there are many better alternatives in the market, or whether the technology that was being used for that initial product no longer is competitive. So in those cases, you end up retiring a product. And that is part of a role of a product manager, dealing with end-of-life products. But in most cases, and I'm going to focus more on the other stages first. So let's start with identifying the problem and evaluating the opportunity. If you join a company, if you join a startup, or if you join an established company, the industry that this company is serving will already have been identified, and potentially at high level what the company wants to do. But you may be asked to investigate a new product or even new functionality for existing products. And if you're looking at a new product, for example, you need to evaluate whether that product is worth building. And the reality is a lot of the products start with people having an idea. But having an idea may not be the best way to start a product. A better way to start is, I have identified a problem, or I have identified an unmet need for a given segment of the market. And if you remember what I showed you earlier about a lot of startups that fail because there was no market need, those are typically startups that started with a bright idea from one of the founders who thought this would be great, this would be cool, but they didn't really validate whether the market cared about their idea. So it is very important to really be looking at, if I have an idea, is that idea solving a problem that exists? So how do you determine if the idea is worth pursuing? So one way to think about it is, on one hand, you want to see the level of value that the customer would see. How big is the customer need? How valuable would it be a solution to that need? And on the other axis, you want to see the level of satisfaction with existing alternatives, because there's probably already something that's trying to address that need. So if you have an idea for solving a problem or a big customer need where the customer sees a lot of value in it, but there are already pretty good alternatives, what ends up happening is you will be in a competitive market, which may be okay, but you already have alternatives in the market trying to solve that need. If you realize that what you're solving is really not a big customer need, even if they're not very good at alternatives, that's pretty stupid, and you probably don't want to pursue that. And this .com is going back to the .com era, where startups were being funded no matter what. There were companies doing some pretty silly things that didn't really solve many problems, and they had a lot of competition. Well, that doesn't happen anymore. I think that the investors learned a little bit, but want to find problems that are worth solving, needs that the customers care about. And of course, the best thing would be to find something where there is a big need and there's not good alternatives. Now, it's not that easy to find, but there are some ways to ask questions that will at least help you get there. So the first question to assess an opportunity is, what is that unmet need that we're trying to address? Who has that need and how will we reach them? You can't build a product to solve a need for a target customer in a market where you can't even get to. So you need to be thinking, who are those people that I would need to be able to reach that actually have that need? Now, do customers even see that need as important? Because that's going to indicate whether they're going to be willing to pay for it or engage or see ads in exchange for having that need solved. And how big is the market? And when? And is the market ready? There's been startups that failed because they were too early for a market. And later on, others came and the market was ready for them. Speech recognition is partly part of that story. But you need to think about how big is that market that you're going to serve, and is that market ready for this great idea you have for solving the need? And then the last one, which is also very important, is, are there others trying to solve that same problem? And if so, what would make us different and better at solving it? So once you've convinced yourself or your company is convinced that yes, there is a problem that's worth solving and that there's an opportunity, now you have to design the solution. And designing the solution is a big piece of this whole product lifecycle. And it has a lot of components. The first one that I'll talk about is the importance of moving from the problem space to the solution space. The second one is we're going to talk about the minimum viable product, what that is and why it's important. We're going to talk about user personas, and we're going to talk about early validation. And all of this are things that the product manager is involved with way before engineering starts coding. So the first step, moving from the problem space to the solution space. And for this, I wanted to give you an actual example of a product that we developed when I was part of Intap. Intap was a company that was delivering software for the legal industry, and specifically for the 1,000 largest law firms in the US, UK, Canada, and Australia. And we had created multiple products to serve the needs of the law firms. And then we started identifying a new problem, something that was new to our clients that they were suffering with. And it was the fact that they had to manage client obligations. It used to be that law firms could dictate to their big clients their terms. But as big clients like Walmart and other big companies started engaging more and more lawyers and started realizing lawyers are very expensive, they started putting their own conditions for those large law firms. Conditions like, if you work for us, you cannot work for that other company that's a competitor. Or if you work for us, you commit to saving the data related to our cases for 10 years. Or if you work for us, you're committed to handling the data security in a very specific way. So the problem was law firms didn't have a way to handle those client obligations because they were not accustomed to that. So the only solution they had at the time was to have a manual Excel spreadsheet where some lawyer was keeping track of what they had committed to do for each of their unique clients. But we wanted to build a product that helped with that problem. And it was a new product. So then we had to go back and figure out, okay, how do we disaggregate more the problem so that we can define the solution? And the problem was the law firms had no way to centralize all those commitments that they had made to the different clients. Each partner in the law firm had some of the contracts, but nobody had centralized view. There was no way to provide visibility into those commitments. Those were hidden in the 60-page long contracts. And there was no way to enforce those commitments to make sure that the law firm was really paying attention to what they had committed to. So as we looked at the solution, we said, okay, we have to build a master database. We have to build the technology to extract from those big contracts what the main commitments are and categorize them so that we can then search and report on them and even integrate to other systems so that they're surfaced when they need to know. So you see here the separation between what the problem is and the solution. But one of the next things that happened, because we're talking to our clients, we're talking to them, understanding what their problems were, all of a sudden the clients also started telling us, well, it'd be really great if we were able to also have a full process to review those contracts before we sign them, not just surface the commitments that they had already been signed. And we want a whole workflow for approvals and tracking of those commitments. Well, to do that, you need to build a lot more functionality in your solution. You need workflows for reviews and approvals and notifications. And what you get here is what I love Dilbert is great at teaching. This is a Dilbert cartoon that exactly tells this story. Like today is the 3-year anniversary of our first meeting to discuss requirements. And we're still discussing requirements. Does anyone else see a problem here? When you're done, can we talk about requirements? So challenge key risk number 1 when you're building a new product is that you're not able to limit the scope of the problem that you're trying to solve in your version 1 of the product. If you keep adding things that you want to solve, you may never be able to get the product out. So in our case, we said, okay, we will deal with this review for new contracts later. We are going to solve first the problem of these existing contracts that the law firms already have signed, and we will surface them. But then the next challenge is that you can always make the features for this first version more and more sophisticated. We were talking about automation for the extraction and categorization, and a lot of analytics to start showing the commitments, and deep integration to other systems. And here is key risk number 2. Let's see how many more features we can cram in. If you try to put every possible cool feature in your version 1, you will not get it done. And here is where this concept of the minimum viable product becomes really critical. There are different versions of the definition of the minimum viable product. One that's pretty well known is it's the version of a new product which allows a team to collect the maximum amount of validated learning about customers with the least effort. This view of the minimum viable product is very selfish from the product perspective. It's like, let's put something out there and have customers validate that it's worth it. And let's just put the minimum amount of functionality out there to validate it. But I believe that a better definition is it's the minimum amount of functionality that provides enough value to your target customers. There is a cost to your customers to trying your product. The cost is higher if your customer is a company, but even if your customer are consumers, they need time, they need attention to decide to even try what you are putting out there. So you better make sure that whatever you're putting out there is the minimum valuable product, has enough value for your customers to make the effort of even using it and then letting you know what they think. So now let's say that you've identified the minimum functionality that you really want to get out to the market in your version 1. So you have an idea of the functionality, but you still have to design the product. What is this going to look like? And here is where the concept of user personas becomes very valuable. User personas are fictional characters built to identify real users' needs, wants, and limitations in order to design the best possible experience for them. If you are designing a product that it's targeting engineers, if you're designing a tool for engineers, your user personas are going to be very, very different than if you're designing a tool that's meant to help elderly citizens understand something new about taxes, for example. So you really need to understand who you are designing for. The concept of user personas also is to get a common understanding of the users and to put every stakeholder, meaning both the product managers, but the engineers as well, into the user's shoes. And the more complex the product, the more user personas you will have. If you are designing a product that's a product for businesses, you may have the IT people, maybe a user persona, if they need to go in and configure a complex product. And then you will have the end users. And then you'll have the bosses of those end users who may just want to see reports. So you really need to think, who are the user personas that you're designing for? And again, your user personas are going to be very different if you are working on a business to consumer product versus a business to business product. Even in a business to consumer product, you may have multiple personas because you may have different target groups. You may have kind of the university students, but you may also have kind of the young career people. Depending on the product, you may have a couple of user personas. And definitely, if you are in business to business, you will have multiple user personas. And as you're designing the product, you may also need to think about your buyer personas. If you're designing a product that's for B2B, your buyer may not be the end user of the product. And while you still need to design the product primarily for those users, you may need to think about stuff that influences the buyers.
Laura, we have a question from Clara. It says, at the beginning of the product lifecycle, this work sounds a lot like the same work that the UX/user research teams do. What are the main differences between these roles? Great question.
That initial stage is one where you want to be partnering very closely with the user research team and the UX design team. But it's the product manager that ultimately has the responsibility to decide how to prioritize what you're building. But that initial research of understanding the needs, understanding what matters to the users, understanding the users, that has to be done very much jointly. And the design team will need a lot of leading there, because the design team or user experience team is the one that best knows how to answer the questions, how to ask the questions so that they are not leading. So it's a great question. There is a very much a joint effort at that point. But when it comes to finally saying, okay, based on what we have learned from this research, these are the things that we're going to prioritize and build. These are the pieces of functionality. That call ends up being made by the product manager. Other questions, Linda?
That's it.
Okay. Go ahead and ask. Those are great questions. So do go ahead and put some of those in the chat if you want. Okay, so let's talk about user experience design. And this was kind of related to the question. So now that you understand your user personas, now you really need to start designing what is this experience going to look like. And a lot of people think of the product in terms of the visual design, what's at the top, what you see, like what is in the screen and the colors. But user experience design goes a lot deeper than that. It's really starting from almost a conceptual design. If you think of Uber, for example, the Uber application started with the conceptual design of a map. The whole application works around the concept of a map. When Intuit did their first kind of QuickBooks and so on, their design, the conceptual design, was around a checkbook, because that's what people knew how to use and balance their checkbook. So there is a concept underneath how you're going to build this product. And then the whole interaction information architecture is like, what is going to happen when the user does a given action? What is the intuitive thing that should happen so that the whole operation that the user is going through this workflows in the product is as intuitive as possible. And as I was mentioning early on about the concept of iteration, there's a lot of validation that can be done at this point. Once you've identified the underserved need once you've identified how you want to address that need, this is really the value proposition that you're presenting to your market. And once you have an idea of this future set and an initial concept of the design, you can do a lot of validation way before you get the engineers to start building anything. And at this stage, you can get feedback at many different levels. The first thing is you get feedback on the value proposition and the messaging. When we were looking at this new product I was describing, the product to help the law firms with those client commitments, I traveled with one of my product managers to see a lot of our clients. And every time we would ask things like, is this a problem you're seeing? Are you starting to face this new challenge because your clients are becoming more demanding? And we started kind of first confirming that the problem existed. And then we would go back and say, hey, you've confirmed that the problem exists. If we were able to offer you this piece of functionality, this capability, centralize the information in one place, extract the most important commitments and make it visible, would it be valuable to you? Or would you need more? So you're starting to really validate those pieces. And then once you get to an actual kind of mock-up of what the user experienced, you can go and then start validating that the users will know how to use the product. And so early validation can start with a hand sketch. You can like, okay, this allowed you to go and do this. But then you can become more and more sophisticated. And typically what the design team will do, or the product managers, if they don't have the luxury of having a design team, but typically you want to have UX designers, they will start with very basic wireframes. And this is a copy of a product called Balsamic that intentionally is very kind of high level, because initially what you want to do with wireframes, you don't want the users that you're doing research with to tell you if they like the colors or the layout. What you want is to first validate if kind of what you're putting in front of them in terms of the functionality makes sense. And then you can start getting into a lot more sophisticated things. There are multiple products that designers use in Vision, Figma, that allows you to start actually putting together interactive prototypes that would allow you to see how a user would go and navigate before you actually have engineering start building the product. And then you can start getting into prototyping with engineering, where you just get them to do some basic stuff so that you can test it with engineers. But that's way down after you've done a lot of other validation. So again, the main message is you can do a lot of validation before writing any code. And engineers are expensive and their time is expensive. So you really want to get a good feel for what you want them to build before you put them to work. So another of my favorite Dilbert cartoons, we interviewed hundreds of users and turned all of their suggestions into features. As it turns out, every user we talked to was an idiot and their dumb suggestions ruined our product. In hindsight, we probably should have talked to people who work outside this building. So the message here is you want validation, but you want validation from your target users. Don't go ask your friends who are going to tell you that everything you're saying is great, or your mom or your family. You really need to start validating with those people who would be your target users. Okay, so we're going to switch to building the product, but let me stop here because this was a really big piece of what product managers need to do jointly with design. I want to make sure that you guys don't have questions or confusion. Nothing? Linda, no questions?
No, no questions.
Okay, so now you've designed the solution. Now the design team already has mock-ups of what you want to build. Product manager knows which ones are the key features that you want to build. So it's time to build the product, or you have engineering build the product. In the olden days, when I first started in product management, the traditional way to build product was what was called the waterfall model, where the product manager creates a very, very detailed document with every single thing that engineering needs to build. And then engineering goes and they kind of do the technical design, and they code, and then they do the integration testing, and then more testing, and then they deploy. And this was done for a lot of the complex enterprise products, and it could take a year to get a new product out. And the challenges with this type of model is that it assumes perfect understanding of the product requirements from the very beginning. It doesn't allow for iterations along the way to adjust things. And so it doesn't adapt well to changes. And if you think of products that took a year to build, that's a little bit dangerous, because by the time you get the product out, it may not be really matching what your customers want. More recently, and what you will probably experience most of the time, is more agile methodologies. And the agile methodologies, and there are a couple of different ones, and you will see different companies using different ones, but the concept around those agile methodologies is that they provide for more iterations while you're building the product. And the first thing is that they define the product in a more customer-centric way, using what is called user stories. So product managers now will write user stories that would say something like, as a risk analyst at a law firm, I want to be able to do this so that I can do that. So it's really trying to force the requirements, but more in the mindset of the customers, the users are going to use that. And it also is designed to have loops that allow for validation hypotheses. So the way it works typically is that you will have the teams work in what we call sprints. So those are those iterations where the engineering team works with the product manager and say, in the next 2 weeks, we're going to build this little piece of functionality. And here's how we're going to validate that we built what we wanted to build. And so those iterations allow for really kind of the product manager to really be seeing that what's being built matches to the requirements. But it also allows for adjustments, right? And it allows for validating even along the way with some of the users. And so it's a different approach. And I don't know how many of you have heard about Scrum. It's one of the most common ones. It does require a lot more cross-functional collaboration. The product manager is working day in and day out with the engineering team. The designers are working day in and day out with the engineering team. In the waterfall model, the product managers worked very, very hard at the beginning and then sort of handed over to engineering, and then had time to go and do market research and work with sales. In this new iterative methodologies, the disadvantage is that some of the other work that product managers need to do gets pushed out. So I'll talk a bit more about that. But this is the more typical iteration type of methodologies that are used in software. Now, certain products don't lend themselves for this as much. If you're building a space shuttle, and you have components or software, you can't sort of do a lot of trials and see if it works. So there are certain types of product that still require a little bit more of the waterfall approach, especially on being really, really accurate with the requirements from the very beginning, because iterating will be very expensive. But for most software companies right now, anything that's B2C, you will see more of this type of technologies, methodologies. So you work with engineering to build the product. Engineering comes back and says, it's ready. The software is ready. We've put every piece of functionality that you wanted. Look how pretty it is. Now it's time to deliver the product to the market. And when I talk about delivering the whole product, it has a specific meaning, because what your engineering team built is sort of your generic product. But if you remember, what you actually did is you promised something to the market. Your value proposition is promising that your product is going to be delivering a solution to a problem. And in many cases, the full solution is not done just with the generic software that you built. So the whole product really are all of the additional pieces that are needed to make sure that the product you built actually is solving the problem the way you promised. And depending on the type of product, there may be a lot of different pieces that you need to make sure get delivered as well. If you are, and I worked in speech recognition for many years, and I worked on the speech recognition engines. The new version of the speech recognition engine might be ready, and you still couldn't do anything with it. For our customers who are large companies to be able to use that new great version of the speech recognition engine, we needed to make sure that we had that integrated into our partners, that we already had the team that was able to configure the speech recognition engine and build on top of it, were trained to use it. So there were a lot of other components that needed to be in place in order for the customers to actually benefit from that engine. Now, if you are in a pure B2C cloud software that you just turn on your website, you probably don't need as many things, but you still need to figure out, okay, how am I going to provide support? If my consumers get confused and they have questions, do I have a support team that's going to answer in emails or chat? So all of those pieces need to come together. And while the product manager doesn't own all of those pieces, the product manager has to be the one making sure that the other teams are coordinating to have those pieces ready. So this is where I kind of thinking about the whole product, because the whole product is what's delivering the solution to your customers. It's very important to realize one thing, that the whole product is critical for competitive advantage. You may have the best software, but if that software is very difficult to implement, to install, or to learn, your competitor who may have a worse product may win. Or if your product needs a strong distribution channel, you may have the best product, but if your competitors are able to get to the channel, they will be the ones winning. So keep in mind that the success of the product depends on you delivering really the full solution, or making sure that that full solution is available to your customers. The other concept is that the whole product can change based on the stage in the adoption lifecycle. If you build your first version of the product and your initial customers are those really great technologists who are willing to go over hoops to really be able to use your product, you don't need to worry too much about a lot of support, a lot of integrations that are pre-made. But as you move into the more mature market, you probably need to bring into the product certain things like integrations or some of the implementation capabilities that your early adopters might have been willing to do by themselves. So the generic product will evolve to incorporate more and more of this whole product, so that eventually it's really easier for those customers to really take advantage of the benefit that you're providing. So I was mentioning that delivering the whole product is not all on the shoulders of the product manager, but the product manager is the one who has to sort of coordinate. And typically what you want to have is this sort of readiness checklist. Of course, you want to make sure that the product is ready, that it has the right quality, that it has the features that you wanted. But you also need to work with product marketing and sales to make sure that the pricing and positioning is ready. You're bringing a product to the market. And again, if it's a B2B product that a sales team needs to sell, you better make sure that they know how to sell it, they know how to position it in the market, and how much to charge for it. If you have a team that is going to be providing the services for implementation, or a support team, you need to make sure that they are trained, that they know what the product does, because if they start getting calls from customers with problems and they don't know the product, they can't serve them. Again, if you have partners, if you are relying on partners for integrations or for a channel, you need to train those. Your product may also need to have considerations from the legal perspective. So your legal team may need to give you the okay. And then, of course, you may need to make sure that the sales team is trained and that the marketing team is trained. What we used to do with my teams is we would then identify the key responsible people for each of those in the cross-functional teams, and then put them in charge of a lot of the trainings, but we would be making sure that those trainings happen. So again, you don't have to do all of this yourself, but you need to make sure that it all gets done. Otherwise, your product will not succeed. And so now you've delivered your product to the market. Great. So now how do you know if it's successful? How do you learn in order to figure out what you do in the next iteration of the product? Again, what you need to do is to measure. But measure what? There's many things that you want to measure from the product, or that your company will want to measure. Of course, one is business success, but that will take some time. But certainly, if the product starts selling, that's a pretty good sign. Customer success is not just that the customers bought the product. It's like, now that those customers have the product, are they being successful? Are they very unhappy with the product because sales told them a great story and now the product is not delivering? So you need to be tracking if your customers are successful and are happy. Now, there are other types of things you track that are more internal. Product delivery. Were you able to deliver the product in time? Or was it 6 months late because the engineering estimations were way off? And was the product delivered with a lot of bugs? I mean, did you release it to the market and immediately start getting complaints that stuff was not working? So was the quality of the product okay? And then you can also be checking product functionality and performance. And this is an area where you, as you are getting the product built, you want to make sure that you instrument the product so that you can measure. And there are a lot of ways to instrument the product so that you can check which parts of the product the users are accessing, which features are they touching. You can instrument performance of the product, right? Like, how long does it take for the dashboard to load? How is that performing? So there are things that you can proactively make sure you're instrumenting in the product so that when you deliver the product to the market, you can see, and this, of course, for SaaS products, this is very valuable because then you can start really seeing, hey, are we seeing that people don't touch this area of the product, or is performance really bad in terms of loading certain pages that you can start addressing? And based on this, what you want to do is iterate. And now you go back and you add version 2. So you want to talk to your customers. You want to understand what else they would like to see, which of the features that you delivered are still a little bit incomplete. It'd be great if they had more functionality. And you go to the next iteration. And for some products, you may have clear versions that you deliver every 3 months, every 6 months. In some products, depending on how you're delivering, you may be delivering new functionality whenever it's ready. But what you want to make sure still is that you're evaluating where you're putting your engineering resources so that you're actually delivering where there's the most value for your customers, and that you are designing with those customers in mind, that you are working with your design team to make sure that the next thing that you release will be successful. And as I mentioned, eventually you may retire a product because it's no longer successful because there's new stuff in the market. And dealing with retiring products can be tricky if you have B2B products that your customers are still using, but you don't want to support that product anymore. As a product manager, you need to figure out what is going to be sort of the migration path. How are you going to move those customers from the old product to a new version of the product? And that, again, is part of what product managers need to do. But you probably won't get to that until later, or if you join a more established company that has mature products and they're starting to look at this portfolio and which products to sort of kill, or at least kind of put in pure support mode versus the products that are going to be growing. So this was a very quick review of kind of the life cycle of a product and the role of product management.